Look live. There we go. Get this party started. All right, so I think we're going. I was putzing around coming up with some ideas for different ways to do some games based off of the theme that I'm working with. And I'm like, I should probably kick on the live. If I'm going to be doing this, might as well share the adventure. So a lot of what I was brainstorming for game design, I should probably do an intro for some of this. If you're joining the show, early or watching this in the archive at some point, this is the second round of tabletop game design, where each night I do a little work on and brainstorm how I'm going to design a tabletop game. The first game we did was a cyberpunk theme one. I'm reworking the art for that. We'll release it as a playable off of, I guess I'm going to go with my Tumblr account for that. What I'm working on now, this is the second round out this year, and working on a design for a game that is, I guess I'm calling it pulp space opera. I don't know how else to call that. It's very, that seems to cover what it's supposed to be. It's very Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon theme. And I'm not entirely sure if I'm doing this as a board game yet or a card game. And so I'm sort of playing with both. And so last night, one of the things I did after I finished up here was wander off into the forest of research on some games I've played in the past, board game style, that would make for an adventure game. Now, one of the things that I was doing some research, I think it was on day one, where I was trying to figure out what kind of category of game to do. One of the things that came up was adventure games as a board game. Now, some of my research, split at one point. Yeah, it's one of those things. There are like different flavors of some of these things, and one of the things that's come up in the past is like I like steampunk too, and cyberpunk, and if you look at some things, there's like you really start to break down these categories even further and further to further specialties. So there's atom punk, which is it's like it's it's like those video games where it's like a 1950s post-apocalyptic, the nuclear war happened and whatever, and so it's like it's got that very kind of like nuclear age aesthetic, the design, the look, and then you have diesel punk, which is sort of an Art Deco, zeppelins and airships and electricity and dynamos kind of thing. A good example of that would be the movie Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow. And then you get into things like steampunk, but there is neo-Victorian steampunk, and then there's something called I think it's called gas lamp. I don't say romance, but fantasy or something like that. And there are these little subgenres that help determine like the flavoring they use in the setting. And Ray gun Gothic is one it's usually used predominantly, I think, for the visual end of the spectrum. So it's really meant more for the art, the visual arts, rather than storytelling. I believe the storytelling for that time frame usually falls more in the realm of pulp science fiction. But pulp science fiction is a little less precise because Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon, rocket ships, and uh, you know, I keep going back. Like the ones that stick in my mind are like Lee Brackett's Princess of Mars, John Carter of Mars, the Barsoom series, and then there's another one that's very similar. It's called Eric John Stark. The Adventures of Eric John Stark, I think, are some of them. They have one collection of his. I think it's a couple of books put together in one giant volume that I read years ago, and it is dark. Oh, it is such a. It's called the Ginger Star, and it was a really dark series of books. I think it was a trilogy, and it's very like Conan and Tarzan with a John Carter of Mars sort of protagonist. I mean, there's a part of it that says that I feel is very brilliant. Um, I read The Ginger Star. I didn't read some of the earlier works, which I think had a more of a pulp science fiction feel. The The Ginger Star was, I mean, I guess it's still pulp science fiction. It's just it had a darker feel to it. It's basically it takes place on a planet where um, its sun is dying, and the dying star is leading to increasing struggles for any of the natives on the planet to survive. And the natives on the planet become more brutal and like it's like an interpretation of like the Mayans during a drought where they would do human sacrifice to appease the gods so that they could have a little more time to try to survive as a population. Only, I mean, this is taking place on a planet where the sun is dying. And so the population there do ritual sacrifice and they're xenophobic, they're primitive, and they're just sort of savage human beings. Not all of them are human. I think some of them are humanoid at least. And it's just it's such an interesting interpretation. It's like it was dark for me to read it when I was much younger. I imagine I would appreciate it a little more now. Now that I've lived enough in the world to have a slightly more cynical view than I did when I was younger. Um, but I, the stories that are supposedly Eric John Stark's stories that occurred before the Ginger Star, I believe, are a little less brutal, but not by much. The main character is uh, a character who was a human whose family were living on Mercury and then died. And so he was raised by the native sort of Aboriginal Mercury people. And because he's so much closer to the sun, he has a dark skin complexion. So he's sort of touted as one of the first people of color to be a hero in a pulp science fiction. Though my understanding is technically he wasn't a person of color so much as he was just chronically sunburnt for the first third of his life. But he was picked up at a young, like an adolescent age, by sort of like a star commando captain who brought him and trained him to be an agent of the government or something. And he's sort of like a diplomat. So he's sort of like raised in a primitive society of non-humans on a alien world, so sort of Tarzan, and then uh, sort of a Buck Rogers or a Flash Gordon type character. It's hard. It's got so many touches of some of that classic pulp storytelling that it's unique, I think, in some ways. And I should track down a volume of the previous stories before Ginger Star, because I would love to see more of that. Um, but other books and story ideas, like I said, Barsoom, Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, Eric John Stark. And I'm reminded of a book I did do a review of. It was a children's series of books of this type. It was Lucky Star by, I want to say it was Bradbury or Asimov. I can't remember. Um, Lucky Star. Let me see if I can look it up here. Star. It was a series of kids' books, and I found so Lucky Star series of books by Isaac Asimov. Um, yeah, that was a fun read. I read Lucky Star and the Oceans of Venus, and Isaac Asimov wrote them under the pen name Paul French, and they're intended for juveniles. They were sort of fun. They were so it's David Star Space Ranger is the first one. Lucky Star and the Pirates of the Asteroids. Lucky Star and the Oceans of Venus. Lucky Star and the Big Sun of Mercury. Lucky Star and the Moons of Jupiter. Lucky Star and the Rings of Saturn. And they were kind of fun, simple, pulpy science fiction books. Okay, so fearing the novel would be adapted into a uniformly awful programming he saw flooding the television channels, he decided to publish it under a pseudonym, Paul French. Asimov began work on the novel David Starr Space Ranger on June 10th and completed it on 29th of July. And it was published by Doubleday in January 1952. Although plans for a television series fell through, Asimov continued to write novels in the series, eventually producing 6. A 7th, Lucky Star in the Snows of Pluto, was planned but abandoned when Asimov elected to devote himself to writing nonfiction almost exclusively. So they look like a lighter, more fun version of some of these story type settings that I want to do. I've been playing around with the idea of um, like, do I do a single main character for the board game? I don't think that's the way I want to go. What I was looking at as I was looking through it, I think my laptop's sliding or my camera's shifting. It seemed like I'm dropping off screen. All right, see if that helps. So, nope. See if that helps. There. Is that better? There. All right. So, doing some research last night, I have a couple of sort of like mock role-playing games, which I think that's the way I think of them. They're sort of like a role-playing light. You don't get a full role-playing game out of it, and I think this is the category they were referring to as adventure games. Because there's not a lot of detail on tabletop adventure games um, before it starts to talk about doing role-playing games. But when you go, there's a parallel link that leads to adventure video games, and they have a little bit more to them because in order to achieve them right, there has to be a certain level of interactivity and response. I think my camera's sliding off the top of my I think that's what's going on. It's not well balanced, I think, at this point. Um, anyway, where was I? So, board games for this style of game, adventure game, start to lean heavily into uh, like conversions from role playing games. Like the newest ones done in that sort of game, they have things like Arkham, no, not Arkham Asylum, Arkham Horror, which they sort of classify as adventure game. But a few games that I've encountered and played, I think fall into that category pretty well. They are sort of a simplification for board game play of role playing games. So like the big one that I did a review of a few years back was Dragon Strike. Now that one has 2 or 3 boards that are double-sided and lets you play multiple scenarios. And they have a adventure book where, like, uh, they have a set of adventures, and for play in the game, you appoint somebody as the Dragon Master, which is essentially the Dungeon Master, and they control all the monsters, and they build the scenario that they're trying to run the other characters through. The booklet has basically, I think it has like 6 or 7 adventures in it that are like one of them's for for one player, not a wizard, and then there are like for 2 players, these types of characters mostly. And so, like, you have some of that and the ability to create new adventures for them. I don't want to build a game that's quite like that, but a little like a little looking into the mechanics of how they pull that off might help me build what I'm doing better. The other thing about those types of games is um, like the one player option is available for one player to play the game by themselves. But there's also another type of, and we've talked about it before. I have my Choose Your Own Adventure books, and among them are adventure game books, which I think I briefly touched on day one where I was doing the research of the category. Adventure game books was in that adventure game category. And the books are essentially the book starts you out as a character. It gives you essentially a character sheet, but it's like it has 3 stats that you keep track of, like your health, your armor, and your attack, or something like that. And um, you keep track of those, and you do use dice to handle random encounters. So at one point, you choose a path in the story. It takes you to a point, it takes you to a page, and in that page is an encounter with a monster, and you roll. If you roll low, if you look lower than this number, go to this page. Higher than this number, go to this page. And I have a few of those books, and I feel like somewhere between the Dragon Strike game and those adventure game books is a series of simple rules that I can apply to individual players on a board to pull off gameplay that would work as a adventure game, borderline role play, but not quite. Like one of the other things about the Dragon Strike game is you don't create a character. I think they're like 8 character cards, and you pick which character you want to play. And that kind of thing kind of works all right. So I would have multiple characters. So Captain Beefsteak or something like that, um, or Beef Cleft Chin, or some Beef Slab, or some other heroic character name as a heroic Earth Rocket Ranger or whatever, and then you could have Arya, the princess of the Amazon Venusians, and some Martian green-eyed or green-skinned, bug-eyed Martian character, and people can pick characters to play. These classic tropes of pulp science fiction, and your map would be the solar system, and uh, you might have a Ming the Merciless kind of villain that you have to overcome, and you can work together or work individually. Um, and I feel like I could achieve some of that with like the character cards from Dragon Strike, some basic monsters to oppose, and instead of magic and spells, it would be pulp science fiction technology, cloning or ray guns or something like that. And then, like, I could do that. I think that's a little bit more involved and more role play than what I'm thinking of doing. And so, like, streamlining the actual adventure portion of the game to be more like those choose your own adventure um, adventure game books, where it's you still roll for beating a monster, and instead of reading a chapter and um, picking a page to turn to, you're you're moving across a board to pick the direction you're going in. And so I think like some compromise between the two of those would work really well for um, a board game design style. So I think what I need to do is dig out one of each of those, like the adventure game book and my copy of Dragon Strike, if I can find it, and do a little playthrough and figure out some of those mechanics and pick and choose the ones I want to do for draft one. Because one of the things I've found in the past when doing things like this is the rules don't splice together perfectly evenly. It's going to be clumsy, but it'll get you the feel for how it's going to work in a certain way, and then you can break the rules to put them together in a way that works better for the finished version of the game. um, I still got to figure out like sort of the narrative I want to use for the game, and I think for like version 1 of this game, it may make more sense to be like Mars, Earth, and Venus, and just sort of have eh, I don't know. The thing I'm dealing with is my tendency to say like there are more opportunities to make this expandable, and I don't want to cut off those opportunities in the first version of the game if there's potential to make more fun to be had with this game in the future. It's there's sort of like and I do have another game that has some pieces that I may want to borrow from. I'll have to dig that one out too. It's a vampire hunter game where it's sort of cooperative. It's all the players pick a player character, and it's like they're all just adventurers, random adventurers. Some male, some female, but it doesn't really matter in the long run. And there's a map of a vampire's castle, and you have to work your way through certain rooms, and you have to get 3 items that'll let you defeat the vampire when you get to it at the end. If you don't have those 3 items, you can't win. And if you get there and lose, you get sent all the way back to the start and start over again. Um, and you go through, and there are tiles that could be one of the items you need, but could also be a monster. And so, like, there's an aspect of that I can include. Um, and that has some very close similarities to the Dark Tower that I was talking about the other night, which again is a map of a large area that you have to travel all around, and you have to collect 3 items that'll let you have what you need to defeat the opponent when you get to the tower. So it's got some similarities to that. I believe Dark Tower runs kind of like a long game. The vampire game runs a short period of time, and there's a mechanic in that game where the vampire can win, so everybody loses. And so that's why it's sort of a cooperative game. It's in your interest to not let the vampire win, but there can still be a one main winner. It's the person who defeated the vampire. Um, so, like playing with some of those options. So, Dragon Strike, the Vampire Hunter, and I don't think that's the name of it, but the Vampire Hunter game, and the adventure role play books that I have. I got to sit down and dissect each of those into a concept of rules that kind of work together enough to get a playable game and build the narrative within that framework. I can come up with a rough idea of what I want to do for a story. Like, is this, make a treaty with each of the different planets and, use that as a collection, and whoever builds their collection the most thing? Or do you defeat a monster or a big boss character, and that's how you win the game? What's the win scenario? Um, are there combat mechanisms for dealing with other players on the board, or is it all cooperative or competition without direct competition? Can you sabotage other players in a sense? And so, like, I got to figure out some of that, and some of that's down to what mechanics I can make work and make sense for what I want to do. So that's really where I'm playing with right now at the board game stage. The card game, I'm struggling a little bit with. Like, my familiarity with making card games is more along the lines of the judge and round sort of games, where you go around and the judge picks the winner of each round, and then the next person becomes judge, and the next person, and the next person, and you go around the table. Each person gets the chance to be a judge, and everybody's playing to win hands. And that's the type of game I'm most familiar with creating. I don't know that I can think of an easy way to do that kind of game for a pulp sci-fi. I mean, I guess there's some cheesy, simple, jokey ones I could do. And there's a type of game out there called Starflux, which is it's a spoof on like Star Trek and Star Wars style fiction, with nods to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and Doctor Who and stuff like that in it. But that's really a bit more of it's a variant on Flux, which is a game in which the basic mechanic is draw a card, play a card, move to the next player, and uh, within that framework, you have cards that change the rules as you go. So there are aspects of it where, like, okay, now in order to win the game, you have to have these two cards, or you have to have the exact opposite of the person in lead, or something like that. The win scenario is getting a hand of cards that give you certain things to win, and I mean that has some potential uh, in the ability to sort of build a series of adventures and missteps and setbacks that can happen to characters in a adventure space pulp game. But I it's still, that's more card game than space pulp. Like it, the space pulp at that point becomes the costume you put on the card game, and not so much the game itself. And so what I've been looking at here are there other game card game styles that I've played with or that exist out there that have the ability to do more of a narrative adventure structure, um, that I could rework and figure out alternative ways of doing. So I'm looking at a couple of them, and I got a couple of them marked over here on some of my pages, um, to look into further. I want to look up later tonight, see if anybody does a review or a basic coverage on some YouTube videos of some of these games. Uh, some of them are sort of more lighthearted, and some of them are meant to be quickie one-off games where it's sort of like, one of them actually is like a game that is literally limited by being a 5-minute game. Their goal is you set up, you sit down, and you've got 5 minutes as a group of people to do this, 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 and this. And I'm like, I don't know. I mean, that, like, I don't want it to be like quick and meaningless and basically a math game like that, where it's just kind of like figure out the numbers on this card and like compare, and then just you win that one and go, 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 go. I sort of want to have some of, like, there is an aspect of some of those old pulpy science fiction stories that have a sort of like a serial um, action story. You do each week the character starts out in a situation and they have to, struggle their way through that situation, and by the end of the episode they've made some progress in one direction but face a setback in another way, and it ends on a cliffhanger. And like, I think that would be kind of fun to be able to do that, but I also want it not to be like a so fast it's like, I got a 5 on top of this card, I need a 5 to beat that card, then we're done. Like, I want it to be like the heroic characters, these two characters together work together to defeat the evil Ming the Merciless kind of game. I want it to feel like you're experiencing a pulp story. And so, I mean, again, it's probably going to be taking rule sets and mechanics from 2 or 3 different games, ripping them apart, Frankensteining them together, getting something that gets the feel right, isn't quite streamlined in the way it needs to be, and then shaving off all the hard edges, breaking some of the rules and making them work in a slightly different way to finish up and get a working system off of that. And I think there's a way to do it, but I'm going to have to track down some copies of some games that I haven't played yet, or at least track down some reviews of them and get a sense for what I can do with a lot of them and what I can make them do. And so I got to see what I can do over the next couple days. So card game may be the harder of the two to do. I'm pretty sure in order to get that to work the right way, it's going to take me a couple days to track down the pieces and parts I need to make that happen. Whereas I know tomorrow I can head down to my storage and dig up one of my action adventure game books. I should be able to find my copy of Dragon Strike and the Vampire Hunter game and just pull up the rules and make like 3 or 4 versions of rules that I think put together the right way make the most sense, and then just sort of feel them out, do some dry run of gameplay idea and see which ones work the best, break them, fix them, put them back together. And that's something I can achievably do in the next 2 days. The card game, that gets harder to pull off in the next 2 days. And so I imagine I'm probably going to end up doing mostly the board game this time round, which is unfortunate. I wanted to do the card game because I did a board game last time, but that's all right. I will keep playing with the card game even when this week is done. Like I'm playing around with some of my writing still. And the scripts for the videos, the skits. So that's sort of where I am right now. I don't know. Once I started really honing in on how I wanted to put these games together and the style and the approach to them, I'm not sure game crafters. Well, let's not sell them out yet. I was going to say I'm not sure how well I'll be able to build the game with game crafters. Because as I tend to do, like when I made my first game, the Cyberpunk game, the Haccess granted, or is it Haccess denied? I have to go back and look again. When I was building that one, my tendency, in order to focus on the story of the game and mechanics of the game and the look of the game, ended up getting me something that just wasn't possible to build using the stuff they have at the game crafters, at least not easily built. I was looking at it the other day. I could probably get a deck of cards made for my game, the Cyberpunk game, for about $20. I could get the boards built, not the way I want them built, but at least passable enough that they could be used. And then, like, once they're made, those would be an additional $15 to $20. And then some of the tiles, they wouldn't be the ideal shape or the way I want them to look, but I could get them done, and that would be maybe an additional $10 to $15. And then like the playing pieces, you could use pretty much anything for playing pieces, but to fit the theme of what I was going for and to build the expansion sets, get the box built and the booklets built, it ends up being like $60 to $80 to produce the game that way. And I don't want to do that. And I'm a little worried that in building an adventure game like I'm playing with right now, one of the risks I'm facing is, like, adventure games don't come with a low number of pieces and simplified parts. Like, you're usually dealing with a deck of cards, some dice, 6 or 7 playing pieces for the players, and probably another 12 to 15 for the monsters or the villains or whatever you want to use. And then you have the board, the rules, 2 or 3 booklets that are 20 pages long total, or sometimes each. And each of those booklets has a complex set of rules and individual tiles and tokens that you place all over the board to do certain things with. Like once you start doing that, it gets expensive. And so I feel like an adventure board game lends itself to becoming expensive quickly. So I'm thinking what I need to do is well, I don't want to sell them out yet. I don't want to say that I can't do it through them. But um, I'll see in the design and the mechanics of how I pull this together whether or not it's viable to do it that way through Game Crafter. Because I mean, when it comes down to it, I mean, I can always do another version of a game where all the parts are printable and posted to Tumblr. I would prefer not to do it that way. It's doing one that way is good. Doing multiple games that way, I'm sure it's still good, but I do kind of want to explore and experiment with different ways of producing things. That was sort of the idea of wanting to switch over to a card game. It was like I already showed one way that you can make a board game available. Want to try a different method now, because there are multiple ways to do these things, and that's half the fun of doing these projects is not being stuck with only one way to do it every time you do something like this. I did have the guys at the Makerspace the other night when I was showing off my Cyberpunk game. They were like, "Oh yeah, you could do these like handcrafted boards," and I'm like, "That's sort of like puts it back into the $30 to $40 board game purchase price for doing that," and that's on top of uh, you know, getting the deck printed professionally, which would be another $20. So it'd be a $50 game again. And, more importantly, like if I'm handcrafting them, that takes me weeks of time to make a few for sale. And then it becomes a full-time job just to produce them. That's a model that I don't want to work on. Like if I'm doing like a chess set, like a handcrafted chess set, and I can charge somebody like $40 for it and they want to do that, that's fine. If you want to experience my board game, I don't want you have to have a $50 entry fee to do it. And I don't want to spend a month making them for people who want to do that. Now, it's entirely possible at some point I may do a limited run of handcrafted or laser cut boards for it if people wanted to order a made version of it rather than a printed version. There are ways I could do stuff like that. That's not a huge difficulty for me. But so the going the route of print and play game again, I have mixed feelings about it. On one hand, there's the reluctance to do it the same way twice, just so I could show different ways to do it. But I just funded a project on Kickstarter. Not mine. There's a company called Cheap Ass Games. Years ago, when I used to do conventions, I did a convention in Connecticut, and I helped the founder of Cheap Ass Games get a ride back to his hotel. I drove him back, and we chatted in the car for a little while about game design because I had taken his workshop, his panel on the topic. And Cheap Ass Games has made hundreds of games over the years, and they just did a Kickstarter campaign where they're compiling into an ebook all the rules of all the games or many of the games they've done over the last 10, 15 years, 20 years of game production. Now, you won't get like the decks of cards or the tiles or the boards, but you get the rules of how the games are played. And I believe most of the games you can find out there would be like a downloadable PDF available somewhere. Because his whole gimmick was making games that could be printed out as books that you could buy off of Amazon or something like that, or out of his store, and they're like card uh, card stock that are perforated, so you can tear the pieces out and play the games with them. They're cheap ass games. They're literally cheap games, and it was making them accessible. And I love that model. So I shouldn't feel too bad, maybe, if I end up following in that path a little bit. But I still, yeah, I go back and forth about it a little bit. But I think I'm probably going to pursue both the board game and the card game. It just may take me longer to get the card game worked out. I should be able to knock out a version 1 of the board game by the end of the week. And actually, what happens after that? So we've got the stories I'm writing, the novel, the novella, and the short story. We've got the videos. I'll have to upload the skits this week. 2 of them at the end of the week. I just didn't get there fast enough. Too much got in the way. But at least by the end of the month, we will have 3 videos, probably a short story and part of the novella written, and an excerpt I can offer for the novel. And then the last, I should have the board game version 1 roughed out. And then after board game is product or service. And I believe what I'm working on this time, I should be able to do a functional prototype during the week. And so by the end of the month, I should have at least something from each of those available for consumption. And I may even go back and live shoot what I was working on for the animation, because I'm not good enough at the animation. If I'm going to ever do an animation again, it's going to be a stick figure animation, because I can't do sequential art well enough to make the character look good enough from frame to frame without it taking like 45 minutes for each frame. And I'm too poor right now to be spending days for 3 seconds of video. I got other things I need to do to make it so I can survive the months of project work. But I do think trying to do a live version of that could give me some experience in some special effects that I could use later when I get into the idea of doing the reimaginings of movies. So that's sort of where I am right now. We're pulling up on like a minute away from 50 minutes. I think we covered everything that I got to cover tonight. I'm going to go back. I need to do some. I wanted to post my next edited video tonight, so I want to see if I can get that up tonight. Prepare the one for tomorrow so that I'm not dragging behind like I am right now. And then I'm going to see if I can do some more crunching on research on board games. Get some reviews of some of the ones I'm looking at and get a sense for maybe some of the gameplay to see if I can quick order 1 or 2 of them off of Amazon for a play test and breakdown of the rules and mechanics. And then moving on from there, I should probably calculate to have time to eat and sleep tonight too. That'd probably be useful. I have occasionally had a friend of mine remind me, like, I was like, I budget for this. I've got, this is where I'm spending my money on these things this month, and this is where my time is. And he goes, you've scheduled in some time and budgeted a little bit of money so that you can eat, right? And he's not wrong to ask me that. About half the time I went, "Oh, yeah, I should probably chunk in a little bit of that there." It's gonna be I need to pay attention to that a little bit. I need to take care of myself so I don't make myself sick, because then I get nothing done. All right. So we're at 50 now. I think I'm gonna call it for the night, and I will see you tomorrow, hopefully with a little more progress on both the edited and the game design. All right. So, good night. Ah, there we go. And